Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now you may remember that a couple of years ago we took a brief look at this. The title of this video is no exaggeration. What we have here is the GTX 780 Ti Lightning from MSI. While the standard 780 Lightning is quite common, the Ti version of MSI's offering was never released. It was demoed at Computex some years back, but Nvidia wouldn't let MSI launch it because of the lack of voltage restrictions. MSI then decided to give away these cards to serious overclockers, all 12 samples. Every time I take this out of the box, I can't help but think about what became of the other 11. Do they still work? Are they still in use? Are they gathering dust at the back of someone's cupboard? Before we go any further today, let me refresh your memory a little regarding my card. The link to the original video will be in the description in case you want to watch my failed attempt at gaming on it first time round. So I found this on eBay and paid about £120 for it, including postage 2 years ago. I asked the seller for a few details on the card, and I also got in contact with MSI, both of whom never got back to me. It's a shame because tracing the origins of this particular card would have been an interesting rabbit hole to go down, but I guess the mystery surrounding it is equally as intriguing. Back in 2018 I managed to test a couple of titles, so it wasn't all bad. These games were Fallout 4 and Metro Redux. I was going to say Exodus then, but no way. Performance was very good, and at first glance it seemed like we were onto a winner. But when I moved on to what I think was going to be GTA, I can't quite remember, the game just crashed, and so did any other game that I tried to play after that. Eventually the system started to freeze without even jumping into any games, and the PC would switch itself off. Despite this, I had always planned to go back and solve this issue. Honestly, I don't know why I never did. After all, I had assumed that the power supply, despite offering 650 watts, was too weak to handle this aging beast. It wouldn't have taken much to retest it after I obtained a Be Quiet 850 watt unit, but by the time that arrived I had moved on to other videos, and I'd put the 780 Ti Lightning at the bottom of my to-do list. As I obtained more hardware and the channel began to grow further, I set my sights on collecting and benchmarking more rare hardware, most of which worked out of the box, further distracting me from a revisit to the 780 Ti. Well, today, after looking for an AM3 motherboard that I misplaced about 5 years ago, I once again stumbled upon this 780 Ti and decided to remind myself why I had cast it aside. This time though, I swapped out my power supply for an 850 watt unit, fired up the PC, and that is when I discovered that the card worked as if it was brand new. Okay, any attempt to mess around with the clock speeds caused an immediate crash, but I could actually get into games again, and for once in my life, I was actually speechless. Never has one of my graphics cards ever fixed itself. I mean, I consider it lucky if I can ever fix them. Seriously though, I assume it just wanted more power, unsurprising considering that this is an untamed and unofficial beast. This revelation also meant that we could see just what the 780 Ti could do in 2020, and that is where the story becomes bittersweet. While the 780 Ti was a top-end card in 2013, costing about $700 US, it has not aged well. For the first couple of games, the FPS counter is missing. I forgot to set it up, but it will be visible starting from the third title. Let's start with the games that suffer the most. While it does have 3 gigs of VRAM, there are some titles where this proves detrimental. Doom Eternal is one of them. In fact, we were limited to the low settings here, albeit at 1080p, and even so 35 frames per second is round about where we'll be frame rate wise. It's a shame really to see an old beast like this suffer at the hands of modern titles, but it's just the way it is. Don't get me wrong, the game looks great at low, honestly, but this sort of performance is not ideal for a first-person action title. If it was a third-person and slower-paced game, maybe I could excuse it. Speaking of which, that's where Red Dead Redemption 2 comes in. Now you may have trouble with older cards and the in-game VRAM limiter. I found that this can be overridden by manually setting your own values in the system.xml file found in the settings folder of your Red Dead 2 folder, which itself is located in your documents. Setting the graphical options outside of the game means that you won't have to deal with trying to find the absolute limits of how far you can turn things up. It could just be easier to opt for 900p instead, which does sometimes mean that you won't exceed said limits, especially when overriding the cap could have negative performance effects. The 780 Ti does not agree with this game. Maybe it's just this card. Now it's the turn of Far Cry 5 at Ultra. Surprisingly, the game does okay, but it is a bit older and isn't as resource intensive. Turning things down a bit would probably mean 60 FPS, but I just wanted to push things as far as possible, to be honest. Now we've also tested the original Titan on this channel, which is the show-off's version of the 780 Ti. So between this and that, performance should be close by a few single-digit numbers. As games get updated over time and different graphics card drivers release, this might change, but I don't think the gap between these two cards will change too much at this point in time. Both of these have their best days behind them. A good example of what I was previously saying can be represented by PUBG. It runs almost as well on the 780 Ti as it does on the Titan with the high settings. The game is still receiving updates, but I think we're past the point of any of these bringing with them performance changes. The game has already been much improved in that regard since launch, and I'm finding that some of my older cards are doing better than they were years ago. That's always nice to see. There will be some terrible stutter here and there, which can be somewhat helped by reducing texture settings, but it won't make it go away entirely. Finally, and you'll see why this is in a minute, it's Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This did better than I thought with the high settings, offering up 47 FPS on average. It was a somewhat delightful experience. Well, maybe not. There is still some stutter, but nothing like PUBG. It is, however, playable, and I might run through this game using this card just to see if it fails on me or not. I'm yet to complete this game anyway, or even properly start it. This is the trial version, in fact. For my next trick, I wanted to give Forza Horizon 4 a quick go, but starting that up didn't amount to much because the game crashed. Now I thought that this was the fault of the card giving up on me again, but after looking into it I did find an old TechSpot article where they experienced crashes with the 780 Ti when attempting to run the benchmark test. I thought maybe this would be fixed by now, maybe it is for other 780 users, but this one just wouldn't budge. All in all, this is a bitter-sweet conclusion. The card has decided to start working again for whatever reason, but in doing so, it's shown us that the 780 Ti isn't up to much anymore. It can still handle itself in a few scenarios, don't get me wrong, but other times it will struggle to hit 30 FPS. In that respect, it hasn't held up over time as well as some of AMD's alternatives, and that's not always reflected in its used price tag. Thankfully, this one will continue to have a special place in my collection, even if it's destined for a museum-like display on a desk or maybe even framed on a wall. So let's say you're sitting there, you've just finished this video, you've taken a look at a few other 780 Ti videos as well, and you're wondering whether or not a card like this is right for you in 2020. Well, let me just say this, it will certainly have its limitations. The 3GB of RAM will give you some problems, and the overall power of the card will be lacking in some areas as well. I am glad that this 780 Ti is working, I can tell you that much, and as you saw there are a few instances like PUBG, like Far Cry 5 for example, where you will have a decent enough gaming experience. But if you spent $700 or the equivalent back in 2013, then I think it's had a pretty good run for that money. There are certainly other AMD alternatives out there that have probably held up better. AMD cards tend to age better than Nvidia's offerings, so maybe at around the same used price point, look out for something from Team Red. I do think the 780 Ti is still certainly a fun card to mess around with, and I found myself going into a lot of games anticipating whether or not they were going to run smoothly. That isn't ideal for the everyday consumer, someone who actually wants to buy one of these, but as a tech reviewer, I use the term loosely, it certainly makes for an entertaining experience. Now I don't know if my results are representative of the bigger picture because I have had problems with this card in the past, but everything seems okay. I mean, that PUBG result was very similar to a Titan result that we saw a few months back, and these two will still be quite similar in performance. The Titan is certainly something you might want to consider instead if you just want those bragging rights, because telling people you own a Titan still sounds quite impressive, though from a practical point of view, maybe it doesn't make too much sense. But there we go. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, it's probably about 2 years late, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.